My sister mocked my son's birthday dinner, and when we asked her to stop, she slapped my husband. The sound cut through the room sharper than the clinking of cutlery or the forced laughter that had been filling the space. Moments before, 1 second my son was smiling at the candles on his cake, his small hands folded in quiet excitement. The next, everything froze. Her hand was still in the air. My husband didn't react immediately. He just stood there, stunned, not from the pain, but from the disbelief. Around us, our perfect family sat in silence. No one moved. No one spoke. My mother looked down at her plate. My father adjusted his watch. My brother let out a soft, awkward chuckle, like this was just another uncomfortable joke that would pass. But it wasn't. I felt my son's fingers tighten around my arm. When I looked down at him, his eyes weren't confused. They were scared. That was the moment something inside me went very still. I stood up slowly, steadying my voice before it could betray the storm underneath. "Leave," I said. No shouting, no scene. Just one word, spoken clearly enough that it didn't need repeating. My sister blinked at me, almost amused, like she thought I'd fold like I always had. But I didn't look at her again. I walked to the door and opened it, holding it there, not for her, but for the end of something I had tolerated for far too long. Now, this time there was no laughter. Chairs scraped. Eyes avoided mine. My sister scoffed, grabbing her bag like she was the one being wronged. My parents followed, murmuring excuses no one was listening to. Within minutes, the house emptied, leaving behind half-eaten food, melted cake frosting, and a silence that felt cleaner than anything that had filled the room before. I locked the door. Then I turned back to my son, knelt beside him, and wiped the tear he hadn't let fall. "It's okay," I told him softly. But what I meant was something else entirely. It wasn't okay, and for the first time, I was going to make sure they understood exactly what that meant. I've always been the quiet one in the family, the one who pays, fixes and smooths things over without asking for recognition. My older sister Layla was the opposite, loud, admired, untouchable. Growing up, her sharp tongue was dismissed as confidence, while my silence was mistaken for weakness. It became a pattern I learned to live inside. When I started my own business, no one believed it would last. When it did, they called it luck. When I bought our parents' medical insurance, covered emergencies, and quietly lent money whenever someone needed help, it was never called generosity, just expected. Layla was the worst of it. She borrowed the most, repaid the least, and somehow carried herself like she was still doing me a favor by being in my life. Every insult she wrapped in a joke. Every boundary I tried to set, she stepped over with a smile. And every time I told myself it wasn't worth the conflict. My husband saw through it early. He warned me gently at first, then more firmly, but I kept believing family meant patience. That loyalty would eventually be returned. It never was. So over time, I stopped correcting them, stopped explaining. I let them think I was still the same, soft, accommodating, easy to overlook. Because people reveal everything when they believe you'll never push back. It didn't begin with the slap. It never does. It was in the way Layla arrived that evening, late, unapologetic, her heels clicking against the floor like she owned the room. She glanced at the decorations, the carefully arranged table, the small cake my son had helped choose, and smiled, not warmly but knowingly. "This is simple," she said, tilting her head. Not cruel enough to be called out, just enough to land. I said nothing. I was used to translating her tone instead of her words. During dinner, she picked at everything. The food was a little dry, the portions a bit small. When my son proudly showed her his gift, a toy he'd been dreaming about for weeks, she laughed lightly, brushing his hair aside. "Oh, that's cute. I thought you'd get him something more meaningful." Her eyes flicked to me, then to my husband, lingering just long enough to be deliberate. Across the table, my mother shifted in her seat but didn't intervene. My father cleared his throat and reached for his glass. No one challenged her. They never did. Even the pauses felt rehearsed, like everyone was waiting for me to absorb it, to smile it away, to keep the evening intact. And I did, at first, but something was changing. Because this time I wasn't ignoring the details. I was noticing them. The moment didn't feel explosive. It felt precise. It happened right after the candles were lit. The room dimmed slightly, soft orange light flickering across my son's face as he leaned forward, ready to make his wish. For a second, everything looked exactly how I had wanted it to be. Quiet, warm, safe. Then Layla laughed. Not loudly, just enough to cut through the moment. "Make sure you wish for better parties next year," she said, almost lazily, as if she were commenting on the weather. My son hesitated, the smallest pause, but I saw it. The way his shoulders dropped, the way his eyes flickered toward me, uncertain. And that was it. Not the years of borrowed money, not the constant dismissals, not even the way everyone else let it happen. It was that pause. I looked around the table, at the familiar choreography of avoidance. My mother pretending to adjust a napkin, my father staring at the cake like it required study, my husband watching me carefully, already knowing something had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't asking myself how to keep the peace. I was asking why I ever thought it was mine to keep. When my husband quietly told Layla to stop, and she raised her hand, I didn't feel shock. I felt clarity. And clarity, I realized, is far more dangerous than anger. I didn't act that night beyond asking them to leave. Precision requires distance, and distance requires quiet. The next morning, I opened my laptop before the house fully woke. My business had taught me discipline. Records, timelines, proof. I approached this the same way I would any client dispute. Calmly, thoroughly, without emotion interfering with facts. Every transfer I had ever made to my family was documented. I had insisted on that years ago, not out of suspicion, but habit. Bank statements, messages confirming amounts, even casual texts where Layla had written, "I'll return it soon, promise." At the time, they felt like empty reassurances. Now they read like admissions. I organized everything into folders: dates, amounts, purposes, medical expenses, temporary support, emergency cash that was never truly urgent. The total was larger than I remembered. Or maybe I had simply chosen not to see it before. Then I contacted a lawyer. Not aggressively, not emotionally. I asked questions, listened carefully, and followed instructions. A formal notice was drafted. Clear, direct, impossible to misinterpret. Repayment deadlines, legal consequences. No room for negotiation disguised as family obligation. I didn't warn them. I didn't argue. For the first time, I stopped giving them the chance to talk their way out of accountability and started letting the facts speak in a language they couldn't interrupt. The notices arrived on a Tuesday morning. I knew the timing because I had chosen it. Early enough to interrupt routine, late enough that they couldn't pretend they hadn't seen it. No calls came at first. Just silence, stretching longer than usual, heavier than before. Then the messages started. Layla's came last. My mother's was confused, almost pleading. There must be some mistake. My father's was shorter, careful. We should talk before this goes too far. My brother tried humor, as if this were still something that could be softened with tone. I didn't respond. Instead, I watched. By afternoon, the confidence had shifted into urgency. Calls replaced texts, voicemails stacked, each one less composed than the last. Layla's message finally came through, sharp at first, then cracking at the edges. Outrage struggling to hold its shape against something more fragile. Court made it real for them. Documents don't argue. Numbers don't forget. The first hearing was quiet. Fluorescent lights, neutral walls, no audience to perform for. Layla avoided my eyes. My parents looked smaller somehow, as if the absence of control had reduced them. I answered only what was asked, clear, measured. When the judge reviewed the evidence, there was no drama, just acknowledgement. And in that stillness, something shifted. For the first time, they weren't deciding how far they could push me. They were realizing they couldn't push me at all. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It spread slowly, like something everyone tried to avoid naming. Family gatherings stopped. Invitations that used to come without thought now ended in silence or vague excuses. When my name came up in conversation, it was followed by pauses too long to be accidental. I became the subject people spoke around, not to. Layla lost her certainty first. At first, she tried to frame it as betrayal. Dramatic words sent through mutual relatives. Carefully curated stories that painted her as misunderstood. But stories need listeners to survive. And people who once laughed with her began asking quieter questions. About money, about agreements, about what was actually owed. My parents changed too. Not in words, but in posture. My mother stopped calling. My father's messages became formal, almost procedural. The emotional weight they once expected me to carry had nowhere to land anymore. What surprised me most was not their reaction, but mine. There was no satisfaction in watching them unravel. Only clarity, the kind that comes when you finally stop confusing respect with endurance. Because the real loss wasn't theirs alone. It was the illusion I had been maintaining. That family meant accepting less of yourself to keep others comfortable. And once that illusion breaks, it doesn't come back. That is what people don't understand when they ask why I didn't just let it go. Months later, The silence stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like structure. My life didn't suddenly become perfect. Nothing cinematic happened to replace what was lost. Instead, something quieter took its place. Control. Boundaries that didn't need defending every week. Decisions that didn't require permission or apology. My son adjusted faster than I expected. Children do, when stability returns. He stopped flinching at raised voices. He started speaking more freely again, as if his small voice had finally learned it wouldn't be interrupted or dismissed. I didn't rebuild ties with my family. There were no reconciliations, no dramatic forgiveness scenes. Only distance, maintained without effort now, like a door that finally learned to stay closed. People sometimes ask if I regret it, if court, exposure, and separation were worth it for just money. But they never saw what I saw at that table. They never understood that the real debt wasn't financial. It was years of being treated as optional in my own life. I learned something I wish I had known earlier. Peace is not something you negotiate with people who benefit from your silence. It is something you protect by refusing to shrink. And for the first time, I was no longer the family's convenience. I was my own consequence.